Right then, I've got this. Hope I've got this right for the speaker gallery, the viewing thing. Fingers crossed. Mercury retrograde. Right. This poster, Ceridwen's Cauldron. I drew it a few years ago, and there's a free version of it on the Facebook group, the Ogham Grove. There's a PDF file. If you go to the files section, you can get a free poster of this. I'll explain it in more detail further on. It's an encoded Star Lore story, the story of Taliesin and Ceridwen. And there's a lot of surprises in it, not just the hidden Star Lore, but the cultural background of the story and the significance of Taliesin to the Welsh bardic tradition. Some of the things I say in this presentation might niggle a few people because it upsets the apple cart a little bit, because there is a tendency, certainly with Irish mythology and Welsh mythology, that a lot of people want to have a kind of purist Celtic culture, if you like, you know. But the truth is, with the Taliesin material, all of it it's Romanized, and that Roman influence doesn't sit comfortably with a lot of people, but we have to take it on the chin. Taliesin, Arthur, Merlin, they're all part of the 5th and 6th century, and it's Romanized Britain, you know, and there had been nearly 400 years of Roman culture influencing those Celtic Britons. And the more I look at it further on, the Greek influence on the Celts was massive, even before Rome conquered Gaul. You know, the old world, before the Roman Empire, you know, go back to about 400 BC, was much more cosmopolitan and socially interacting with different tribal groups than people realize. Even the Irish foundation mythology is a series of invasions. So it's an acknowledgement that various waves of people came from somewhere else, you know. So anyway, that aside, there's going to be quite a bit of Roman stuff talked about in this presentation. But before I get to that, then, the story of Taliesin and Ceridwen is rather late, and I'll come to that. But simplistically, there's a famous shape-shifting animal chase, and I'll go through it quickly, then I'll go through it in more detail. Basically, before Taliesin is even Taliesin, he's just a lad. He's a common, humble boy, and his name's Gwion. And Ceridwen has given him this task of stirring this magical cauldron for her. And she's trying to get 3 drops of inspiration for her son. And her son is called Morvran, which means great crow or great raven. And he's a very unfortunate boy, Morvran. He's ugly and no one wants to know him. So she figures that, you know, she's being maternal. If she can give him great intelligence and the ability to speak well, then that will override his ugliness and he'll be accepted in King Arthur's Round Table and all of this stuff, you know. So she's making this cauldron of inspiration that will give up 3 drops of pure inspiration to make her ugly son, the great crow, wise. Anyway, the whole process of making this potion takes a year and a day. And Gwion, the lad, has to keep stirring this cauldron for a year and a day. Anyway, at the end of it, accidentally, 3 drops of hot liquid land on his hand, and instinctively he puts his hand in his mouth because it's burning. And he gets the 3 drops of inspiration that were meant for her son. And he instantly realizes that he's in deep, deep trouble, you know, and she realizes that he's got the inspiration. So then this animal shape-shifting thing happens, and Disney used it in their King Arthur animation, where the young Merlin is shape-shifting animal chase from the old witch. I don't know what her name is in that. Anyway, so Gwion turns into a hare, and Ceridwen turns into a hound and chases him. So it's a hound chasing a hare. And then the hare comes to a river and it jumps in and becomes a fish. And Ceridwen, as a dog, jumps into the river and becomes an otter and chases the fish. And then the fish jumps out of the water and becomes a bird, and the otter jumps out of the water and becomes a hawk. And so the hawk chases his other bird. And then, still trying to get away, Gwion, as a bird, sees a granary with lots of wheat all over the floor. And he lands down and turns himself into a tiny grain of wheat to hide amongst all the other wheat in the granary. And Ceridwen, as a hawk, lands and turns herself into a black hen, and she finds him and eats him. Now, here's the thing, and this kept me awake for about 3 nights. And I think it was about winter solstice some years ago. And it was just one of those things that niggles your brain. She consumed him, and he was inside her for 9 months. It's specific in the story. He was 9 months in her belly. And then she gives birth to him at Beltane. You know, so what was niggling me and keeping me awake was, what was the significance of the 9 months and being born at Beltane? You know, there's a kind of backstory playing out somewhere there. And that Gwion had to stir the cauldron for a year and a day suggests it's a year wheel story. So it took my little brain quite a while of churning things over. And then I had my little eureka moment, you know, and that's what this poster is then. The whole shape-shifting animal chase is star lore. You know, it's not just shamanic shape-shifting or fairy tale. It's very precise star lore is what it is, you know. And because from his birth at Beltane, you can go back 9 months to when he was consumed. That's the end of the animal chase. So you know when the animal chase ends, 9 months before Beltane sort of thing. So all the clues are there, and there's more clues, which I'll show later. But just to look at the poster then. So it begins here with, this corner is Beltane, and you've got constellations. So the constellation of the dog is Canis Major. And there's a constellation of the hare, which is called Lepus or Lepus the hare. So the dog and the hare are in the night sky as constellations close to each other. So that's the beginning of the chase, if you like. He's had the 3 drops of inspiration, hare and dog. And then Lepus, the hare, comes to a river, and there is actually a constellation of a river called Eridanus, and that's next to Pisces, the fish. So in the story, the hare comes to a river, jumps in and becomes a fish. And Ceridwen shapeshifts from being a hound into an otter. Now, there isn't a constellation of an otter, but there is Cetus the whale, which is in the same area and is kind of pursuing. But the river and fish are there in the night sky. And that takes you that way round the circle. And then the fish comes out of the water into the air, and she becomes a hawk to chase him. And that's the constellations of Cygnus the swan and Aquila the eagle. 2 of the summer birds are there. And then the final bit is down here where you're at Virgo, and there's a bright star in Virgo called Spica. And Spica is the ear of wheat, a single white bright star. And that's what he becomes. He becomes a single grain of wheat. And she becomes a black crested hen and eats him. So right here by Spica, the ear of wheat, is the constellation of Corvus, the crow, but it's a black bird. So the dog and hare are in the night sky, the river and the fish are in the night sky, the birds are in the night sky, and the grain of wheat and the black bird are there in the night sky. And if she eats him here at Virgo with the grain of wheat, 9 months later, he's born at Beltane. So that's all there as a story in Welsh bardic lore. Well, not everything's straightforward. So the story comes from a book called the Haines Taliesin, which just means the story of Taliesin. And shortly I'll go over Taliesin. Taliesin there's much older archives for Taliesin, but the story, the Haines Taliesin, is late. It comes from the 1500s. It was written down by a Welsh writer, poet called Ellis Griffith, around about the mid-1500s, so 16th century. Now, it's often considered one of the stories of the Mabinogion, but it isn't. Now, here's a thing. So this is my favorite copy of the Mabinogion. It's illustrated by Alan Lee, who did artwork for Lord of the Rings and stuff. But what's really nice about this, apart from being a hardback, is it's a proper translation of Lady Charlotte Guest's Mabinogion, which is the first version. It contains 13 traditional Welsh stories. And Lady Charlotte Guest, around in the early 1800s, compiled them all together and called that compilation the Mabinogion. That phrase was in use already before her, but this collection of 13 stories, Mabinogion, only really 4 of the stories are proper Mabinogi. They're the first 4 branches, branch 1, branch 2, branch 3, branch 4. They're the Mabinogi. And then she added another 9 traditional Welsh stories and called the whole thing the Mabinogion sort of thing. Now, before I move on from that, this version of the Mabinogion is a more up-to-date version. The author's name is, I don't know how to pronounce it, it's Sioned. Is it Shona or Shoned?
Sioned.
Yeah, so Sioned Davies. This is probably the most reliable translation academically. However, she's a purist in the sense that in here, there's no Haines Taliesin. She doesn't consider it part of the Welsh stuff because it's too late. You know, the stories in here are from the Red Book of Hengist and things like that. So they date back to the 1200s, 1300s, whereas the Haines Taliesin, 16th century. But the reason, so this might be better academically, but this is worth its weight in gold. And I'll tell you why, because, where have I marked it? At the back of it, there's Lady Charlotte Guest's notes. Now, her notes amount to over 100 pages of extra details, kind of like a narrative about the stories and background notes and things. Now, you don't get that in the modern Mabinogion. It's just a modern up-to-date translation, but it's worth getting Lady Charlotte Guest's to have all of the notes in the back are very, very useful. Right then, so whilst the story of Taliesin is late, mid-1500s, Taliesin himself is an authentically old Brythonic character. Now, this book credited to a writer called Nennius, dates to about 830 AD, and it's the first reference of Taliesin. And it's also the first reference to King Arthur as well. They both appear in this book first. It's called, in modern English, The History of the Britons, but it's not a history. Even the identity of the writer, Nennius, has been called into question by the academics, whether there really was a guy called Nennius or he's just an anonymous pseudonym. But even he himself, whatever his name was, he says, I've made a heap of all that I could find. And that's all it is. It's not a proper history. It is a heap of random bits and pieces that he's managed to salvage from Dark Age Britain, you know. So it's bits of history of the Britons, bits of fantasy history, like Arthur chasing the magical boar and things like that. So even Nennius himself calls it a heap of all he could find. Now, there's just one passing reference. It's broken down into small sections, barely a paragraph for each section. And the 62nd section, so remember this dates to the 9th century, then 830. And it's just saying that, this is a modern translation, at the time of Autajern, King Vortigern, then fought bravely against the English nation, that would be the Anglo-Saxons. And then it describes that there were 5 meaningful or famous bards at that time. One of them is called Tauhern Tad Arwen. And this reference to Arwen is the earliest written evidence to Arwen that's used by modern Druidry. So the first bard is Talern Tad Arwen, and he was famed in poetry. And then there's Aneurin, the bard, and then Taliesin is mentioned. And then there's 2 more bards, Blukbard and Kian. And it just says they were all simultaneously famous in British verse. And that's all you get. You just get this passing reference to Taliesin in one paragraph in the Historia Brittonum by Nennius. It isn't then until, as far as I'm aware, 1150. So that first reference to Taliesin is 830 AD, and then more is written about him in 1150, and I'll come to that in a minute. But Taliesin would have lived in the late 500s. You know, he's a 6th century poet, bard, and he's semi-historical, you know, because he was, according to the North Welsh material, the court bard of Urien ap Reged, a king of Cumbria, the Lake District. And when he was assassinated, his son, Owain ap Urien, Taliesin was his bard. And there are many, 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 many poems credited to Taliesin, some of them really famous. But he also writes about these Dark Age nobility that he worked for, Urien of Reged and his son Owain. You know, now the famous Taliesin poems are probably The Spoiling of Annuin, which talks about the adventure to the other world by Arthur to find a cauldron and only 7 survive and all that kind of thing. And then there's another poem called The Battle of the Trees, which holds a lot of strange tree lore, like Alder tree being the vanguard of an army. That's all credited to Taliesin. So he was definitely a powerful presence, but there's very little known about him, really. So there's that one paragraph from 830 AD. Now, the next main bit of literature about him is called the Vita Merlini by Geoffrey of Monmouth. This dates to about 1150. It's only a small, thin paperback when it's translated into modern English. And it tells the story of Merlin going mad really we would now say sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a battle in north of Britain, near Hadrian's Wall, that kind of area, but it was a civil war battle. It was Britons fighting Britons. And at a time when Saxons were invading from the east and the Irish were invading from the west, and rather than defending their land, the Britons were fighting amongst themselves. And it was that pointless bloodshed that in the story drove Merlin mad. You know, he just couldn't cope with, you know, rather than people trying to save their land, they're killing themselves. So that drove Merlin mad, and he ran north to the Caledonian forest. And that's where this story picks up, 1150 AD by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So it's about Merlin living mad as a wild man in the Caledonian forest, and his sister lives nearby on the River Clyde. There's a famous rocky island called Dunbarton, which means the Rock of the Clyde. And that's where Merlin's sister lives. She's married to King Riddick of that area. Anyway, that's also the story where his sister builds Merlin an observatory for studying the stars and everything. You know, it's got 70 doors and 70 windows and 70 scribes to write down all of Merlin's star watching prophecies and so forth. Anyway, in the story, Merlin asks his sister to call for Taliesin. And there's a whole scene, quite a lengthy scene, where Taliesin comes north, presumably from Cumbria or North Wales, to the Caledonian forest, and he meets with Merlin. So you have this amazing scene, it should be turned into a film really, of Taliesin and Merlin having a long discussion together in the Caledonian forest. And they're talking theology, theosophy, talking about science and the nature of the universe as they know it, or as Geoffrey of Monmouth knew it in 1150 AD. And amongst their conversation, Merlin, who seems a bit mad still and vague, it says, "What happened to Arthur?" And Taliesin explains how they took Arthur by boat to the Fortunate Isle, where the Lady Morgan received him in a kind of otherworldly place, you know, to treat his grievous mortal wound and stuff. So Taliesin was there apparently with Arthur's final journey into the West and stuff. And as they're having this conversation, a spring of water bursts out of the ground next to them. And it's like a miraculous spout of water. And Merlin drinks from the water, and instantly his madness is cured and he returns to his own sanity again. That story then leads on to another Welsh tradition called the 13 Treasures of the Isle of Britain, in which Merlin and Taliesin gather these 13 treasures together so that they don't fall into the hands of the Anglo-Saxons. It's kind of an acknowledgement that, you know what, it's all lost, but we're not going to let the enemy have our sacred things. Most of those 13 treasures relate to star lore and ancient mystery traditions, you know, but that's something for another day. So, where's that book? I'll read a little bit from the Haynes Taliesin. There's some fascinating details in it. So we're back now to the 1550s. Where have we gone? Right, so I won't read the whole thing. I'm just going to read a little paragraph. This is near the first. This is the first page. This is Ceridwen having Gwion begin stirring the cauldron for a year and a day. So she resolved, according to the arts of the books of the Ferilt. So I'll stop there first. There's a funny word, Ferilt, and it's spelled F-F-E-R-Y-L-L-T, Ferilt. And it's a word that's been well misunderstood by early writers. People like Lewis Spence with the Mysteries of Britain considered the Ferilt to be a secret druidic order of alchemists and magicians or what have you, you know. And because the word Ferilt is very similar to fairy, a lot of people have thought, oh, it's the books of the fairies as well. But it's not. Sadly, it's neither alchemists, magicians, or fairies. What it actually is the Welsh way of saying Virgil. Now, Virgil was probably the most famous poet of the Roman Empire. He wrote many things, but what he's famous for mostly is the Aeneid, which tells the story of Aeneas going into the other world to see the ghost of his dad and all that sort of stuff. So it's about human interaction with the other world. Now, Virgil's books became, because what inspired his Aeneid was the Orphic mystery tradition and the Eleusinian mystery traditions. They became known as magical books, you know. So Books of the Ferilt is actually an echo of magical books, you know, but it's not magic like Gandalf and Merlin. It's spiritual mysticism from the ancient mystery schools, like the 13 Treasures, you know. And I'll come back to Virgil's Aeneid further on as well, because it's very interesting and it has relevance to the Taliesin story. So she resolved, according to the arts of the Books of the Ferilt, to boil a cauldron of inspiration and science for her son, that his reception might be honorable because of his knowledge of the mysteries of the future state of the world. So it's mysteries and sort of premonition that it would give him. Then she began to boil the cauldron, which from the beginning of its boiling might not cease to boil for a year and a day, until 3 blessed drops were obtained of the grace of inspiration. So this stirring for a year and a day is really important. Recently, you can find it on the YouTube channel. We did a session about the central stars at the center of the grove. Now, if you go and watch that, you'll see the relevance of the stirring of the year wheel, you know, and the circumpolar stars being stirred by the ladle or Big Dipper, Ursa Major, of the goddess at the center of the Milky Way, you know. So there is this heavenly matriarchal goddess in the center of the night sky with a ladle stirring the night sky, and that's there. So look that up on the YouTube channel. And she put Gwion back to stir the cauldron, and a blind man named Morda to kindle the fire beneath it. And she charged them that they should not suffer it to cease boiling for the space of a year and a day. And here, just to confirm that it's star law and astronomy and stuff. And she herself, according to the books of the astronomers and in planetary hours, gathered every day of all charm-bearing herbs, you know. So the whole stirring of the cauldron is defined by books of astrology, planetary hours, but also gathering herbs, gathering plants or some sort of botanical law relating to planetary hours and astrology and stuff. It's very enticing to think about all of that. So where did I put that bit? The Roman influences then. So, you know, the story of Ceridwen and Taliesin is bardic, and it's Welsh bardic lore, but it's late, it's the 16th century. But the books of the Ferrilt are a reference to Virgil's Aeneid and things. And I would argue, and I'll give some evidence for it further on, that Ceridwen too is from the Roman goddess Ceres, or Ceres, the cereal goddess. Now, first of all, there are no other stories of Ceridwen. She's not in any other Mabinogion stories. She's not in any other Welsh literature. She's only in this Haynes Taliesin of the mid-1500s. She doesn't appear earlier, as much as we would love her to. But if we take it on board that the Welsh people or the descendants of Romanized Brythonic Celts, here's a thing then. So in South Wales, near Newport, one of Ellen of the Ways, one of her 3 cities is Caerleon. And Caerleon is wonderful. There's a Roman legionary museum there. And one of the amazing things there is that there was a Roman bath, the Romano-Britons swimming, and their jewelry, they had finger rings, and their finger rings had gemstones in them, and their gemstones were carved with all manner of religious and mystical symbolism. Now, the Romans were good at doing underfloor heating and viaducts and aqueducts and stuff, but they didn't have super glue. And swimming in the baths, the semi-precious gemstones would fall out of their finger rings on quite a regular basis. And archaeologists at Caerleon found loads of semi-precious stones in the gutters of the plumbing of the Roman baths with all these gemstones in. So there's a great little book I picked up there called Roman Gems, tiny little thing, but you can see these are stones from finger rings. Now, just click, there's one there with a goat on. Quite an art form in itself, carving semi-precious stones. Now, this one, lovely. You might see that. So what it is, it's a thing called a modius, which is for measuring grain, and a pair of scales, and the scales are for weighing the grain. And above or sitting on the modius is a raven, so you've got grain and a black bird, Now, I'll read what it says. And this is archaeology, So this is from about 75 AD, very, very old. A pair of scales is shown balancing on a modius, which was a vessel used for measuring grain. So you've got a vessel measuring grain. Some wheat is sprouting from the modius, which is closely associated with Ceres, the cereal goddess, the Roman goddess of the harvest. The bird sitting on top of the scales is a raven, which was thought to possess powers of prophecy. And the Romans sometimes taught them to say words and phrases. But just go back to art symbolism. You've got a vessel and a raven. Now that happens in the night sky where Leo meets Virgo. You've got Crater, the wine mixing cup is the vessel next to Virgo, and right next to that is Corvus the crow. So they're there, But that aside, that's evidence of Ceres, the cereal goddess, having a presence and an influence in southern Wales, what would we say, 1400 years before the story of Ceridwen was written down. It's worth thinking about. Now, here's another one. This is a lovely Roman Somerset. And there you've got Aeneas having a cuddle with Dido. Okay, this is from a famous Roman mosaic found at Lowham in Somerset, and it's on permanent display at the Somerset County Museum in Taunton. It's on the floor. It's about 20 foot square, this mosaic, and it's scenes from the Aeneid by Virgil, you know. So that's two archaeological evidences: Ceres at Caerleon, symbolisms of Ceres at Caerleon, and in Somerset, a massive mosaic all about Aeneid, which was Virgil's big mystery tradition poem. Now, the Aeneid thing is quite interesting too. If you look at Ceridwen and Gwion story as a rite of passage or an initiatory rite, you know, and at the end of it, the lad Gwion becomes Taliesin, the chief of bards, the radiant brow, you know, so he's an enlightened initiate, if you like. The mystery traditions always involved this kind of descent into the underworld, learning some meaningful insights in the underworld, and then coming back to the normal reality, inspired or enlightened or what have you. So just very quickly before I finish then, in the Aeneid, Aeneas wants to go to the underworld to see the ghost spirit of his father who's died. And he goes to see a famous oracle called the Sibyl of Cumae. She's about 700 years old. And everyone's probably heard of a book called The Golden Bough by James Fraser, you know, and she says, yes, I'll lead you to the underworld to see your father, but only if you first get a golden branch from the woods near here. So that's interesting because that's some sort of tree lore right at the beginning. You know, there's a sacred grove, you have to get this golden branch. He gets the golden branch, and as soon as he takes it, another one grows in its place, you know, but you can't go into the underworld or the other world without the golden branch. It gives you permission, sort of thing. So then with the oracle, they go down into a cave and they come to the river Styx, and the ferryman takes them across, you know, and then they come to Cerberus, the three-headed dog, and the oracle gives him some cakes that are laden with alcohol and it makes him sleep, you know. So they put the three-headed dog to sleep, and then they journey through Hades, through the underworld, until they come to a beautiful river in the Elysian fields, and there is the spirit of Aeneas's father, and he tells him all sorts of things that help him and gives him insights into the metaphysical reality of the universe, if you like, you know. But what's interesting is that at Paradise, the Elysian fields, the river there is the Eridanus. So it's up in the heavens again. So just to go back to here, the blackbird and the grain, Ceres, the grain goddess, and everything, that's the descent into the underworld. And in the Aeneid, the oracle takes Aeneas into a cave, and they come to Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guards the stargate to the other world, you know, and then they come to the river Eridanus, and that's where Aeneas meets the spirit of his father, you know. It's interesting. And so just to finish it, Taliesin is born at Beltane, which is, where's Beltane? Beltane's here. And Ceridwen, as much as she was angry with him for getting the 3 drops of inspiration, she can't destroy him because he's such a beautiful baby. And so, like Moses, she puts him in a basket and sends him downriver. So born at Beltane and downriver to the river Eridanus again. And that takes you to Pisces, the fish. And Taliesin at the end of the story is found in the salmon weir, in the salmon weir of Gwythno Garan here, which is a important hero relating to the 13 treasures. One of them is a magical basket, a salmon basket, belongs to Gwythno Garan here. And Gwythno's son Elphin finds Taliesin baby in a basket, pulls back the blanket and sees his shining forehead and says Taliesin, which is just Welsh for radiant brow. And so Gwion, reborn in the salmon weir, is the radiant browed Taliesin, chief of bards. Okay, so you can turn your microphones back on and we'll chat.
It's such a masterpiece. Such amazing star lore, archaeoastronomy.
But it's there with Aeneas and Aeneid and even Ceres is there in Caerlleon.
Revelatory. Awesome. I would amplify it with Spica representing the grain of wheat, also represents the ergot, which is like the LSD derivative, which opens the third eye to enter into the underworld or the other world of visionary, a dream, like a reality that's very dreamlike, but the mind is wide awake.
I mean, that cauldron was getting all manner of herbs thrown in.
Yeah.
There's lots of artwork, which would come to further on in the year because it's the cusp between Leo and Virgo. And that cusp between Leo and Virgo is where you get the vessel and the constellations of the vessel and the crow. And this is almost universal, certainly European, ancient world starting point for descent into the mystery traditions. So it's roughly harvest time that you descend down into the dark part of the year before rising again, And so, the Virgo figure is governed by Mercury, so she's threefold often, and to me, that's an obvious reason why Hecate is three goddesses in one. And it's why she holds a torch. A lot of these mystery tradition figures hold torches because they're leading you down into the descent, where you're going to learn stuff. These were the mystery schools. So Virgil, his poems were inspired by the Orphic mysteries, Orpheus, which is a decapitated god like Bran, Orphic mysteries, and Elysian mysteries. And the main goddess for the Elysian mysteries was the Greek goddess Demeter. But Ceres is the Roman equivalent of Demeter. Ceres and Demeter are the same. And Ceridwen is really 16th century Welsh bards. They have this Ceridwen figure overseeing literally a descent at the time of the year where there's a black crow in the vessel and the consuming of an unknowing person who after 9 months is going to be all-knowing, sort of thing, So it is suggestive that the Welsh bards in the 16th century were doing some sort of mystery school stuff.
Mysteries went underground. They didn't disappear. They had to operate under the radar of the burning church.
Yeah, kind of how we started this evening, isn't it? And I think in a way, things like Freemasonry kind of almost a salvage yard of mystery traditions, and pseudo-Christian because it's all Old Testament symbolism they use, Solomon's temple and stuff. So you can't be burnt as a pagan because you're kind of using biblical things, but it's certainly very mystery tradition stuff.
Now, the cusp of Leo and Virgo will be opposite the cusp of Pisces and Aquarius, which is, where we are here in the big transformation between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius, which is this long twilight. But we are at a really curious punctuation, a whole series of strong punctuations between one age and the next that has been going on for decades now. Every time you turn around, there's another really significant sign in the sky of this, the twilight zone. We're in it.
Up until, my background was Glastonbury, and the main favored legend of Glastonbury is this story of Joseph of Arimathea bringing the Holy Grail there in the 1st century and stuff, and that, apart from being from the 13th century, it annihilates the Celtic church history of St. David founding Glastonbury. But there is no archaeological evidence in Somerset of 1st century Christianity. There's no evidence until the 7th century. And what
I learned in your book.
Yeah, I did a book called The Pagan Temple of Glastonbury Tour, and there's tons of evidence of Romano-British Celtic paganism thriving until the 4th, 5th century. And, the mosaic floors are there in the museums, and there are many evidences of pagan temples around the Somerset levels, So part of the history that people don't realize is that the early church, and this is well recorded, either reused old pagan sites or trashed them completely, so the evidence for them was deliberately erased. So relating to where we are now then on the cusp between Pisces and Aquarius, I think the Aquarian age is about the mysticism, wisdom of all cultures coming together. Wherever there's light, isn't there? And a lot of that means peeling back the layers to see what was under Christianity and what did Christianity hide, and so on and stuff.
Yeah, the divine feminine and the vessel. The Aquarian vessel probably has some like counterbalance with the vessel of Caradwyn in Virgo, and between Virgo and Leo.
Yeah.
So
although I said there's no earlier evidence for Caradwyn other than this 1500s, if you strip it away to just the goddess stirring the cauldron, that's as ancient as ancient. That's there in the night sky at the center, the circumpolar stars. So the goddess stirring the cauldron is very, very, very old. It's just the Caradwyn Taliesin story is 1500s.
And I would guess that the Joseph of Arimathea story may be an attempt to Christianize star lore, create some Christian version of star lore, and that we would find somebody representing Joseph of Arimathea in the sky if we could put it all together.
There's a pattern called the Royal Star Cross. So if you think of a circle and put an equal armed cross in it, and the top of the cross is Aquarius, so directly opposite is Leo at the bottom. So next to Leo, where Leo joins to Virgo, you've got the heavenly vessel and Corvus the crow. So that bowl is at the foot of the cross, So if you have a sacrificial victim on the cross and they bleed and the blood flows down to the heavenly vessel, So the Joseph of Arimathea collecting the blood of Christ at the crucifixion, it's star lore again, it just like Jesus and John the Baptist corresponding with winter solstice and summer solstice.
Yeah.
The Joe of A thing is, those medieval people were repackaging star lore into stories.
Yeah. And I think we could make the case that, and I've gleaned this from your book, that Mary Magdalene is at the foot of the cross with the vessel. And the part of the quest of the Holy Grail is to find her and reinstate her as divine feminine figure of Venus that she is.
amazing. The diagram of Mithras where there's zodiac signs around him on Hadrian's Wall, and on either side of his head is Cancer the crab and Leo the lion. So you've got moon and sun.
Oh yeah,
by the moon, and Leo's the sun, and then going down you've got Gemini and Virgo, then Mercury, and so on. But it gives you this idea of this cusp between the moon and the sun. That moment, that cusp, is the 22nd of July. That's Mary Magdalene's feast day. So she's the goddess of the mysteries there, isn't she? The liminal space between sun and moon, And
in the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they identified the Albigensian heresy as the cult of Mary Magdalene in France, where they maintained that Jesus and Magdalene had a child named Sarah, and she went with Magdalene to France. And that was the Second Crusade, was sweeping through France to expunge that branch of ancient Gnosticism.
In the Ceridwen,
pardon me.
In the Ceridwen story, there are three vessels, aren't there? There's the cauldron, and then her pregnant belly, and then there's the ball croin, the leather bag or the coracle that Taliesin's put in when he's pushed out onto the water.
Yes.
So there's almost three sort of different gestations going on there.
Yeah, different vessels of process or something. And then he's found in a salmon weir, so that's kind of a fourth thing.
I wonder if there's a significance to how long he was out on the water for, because how long is it? I think it was like 40 years or something.
Wow.
And you say there's no other instance of Ceridwen in the writing, but I think that some have suggested an association in the fourth branch of the Mabinogi with Henwen, the white sow, who eats the flesh and the maggots that fall from Llaw Gyffes when he's transformed into an eagle, and he's in the branches of the tree. And some have suggested that is as well Ceridwen in a different form.
I know it's there as an idea, but her name isn't in print in the fourth book.
No.
But yeah, I mean, the symbolism of the sow is very interesting as a creature of the underworld. Well, kind of, it's like a badger. They're underworld creatures, aren't they, and stuff. Here's the thing, the only authentic Mabinogi stories in the Mabinogion are the first four branches, and the glue that glues them all together is a character called Pryderi. So book one is about Pwyll becoming Lord of Annwn and marrying the sovereignty goddess Rhiannon, and they have their child Pryderi. So he's the child in book one. Book two is the story of Bran and the waste of everyone dying in Ireland and only 7 survivors. And 2 of those 7 survivors are Bran's brother Manawydan and Pryderi. So Pryderi just has that little appearance. He's one of the 7 survivors. And then in branch 3, it's Manawydan and Pryderi has Manawydan marry Rhiannon. So he's the second husband of Rhiannon after Pwyll. So Pryderi's there in that kind of matchmaking. And then the 4th branch is about Gwydion, the god of magic, and the creation of Blodeuwedd, the flower goddess, and everything. And but before that happens, there's a very, it's tragic really, but Gwydion kills Pryderi. And what that is, that the Welsh of North Wales and the Welsh of South Wales are not all one cohesive people. They're tribes of people at odds with each other. And originally what we now call Wales was 4 or 5 tribal territories before the Romans came. And then when the Romans left and the Anglo-Saxons expanded, all of the Britons went west. So they piled into the so-called Welsh mountains, and it kind of became a not nature reserve, a reservation of Celtic Brythonic people, you know. But Wales wasn't big enough, so they retreated to Cornwall, and they went to northern Gaul and created what became known as Brittany, because there were so many Britons there, you know. But that's kind of like a forced exodus. The point I'm saying that is, when you get to the Welsh stories, you've got Rhiannon as one goddess, and Arian Ro as another goddess and stuff. And it's because there's no cohesive one culture. It's stories from lots of tribal groups, you know. And whether Ceridwen was there as an authentic goddess of a tribal group, don't know. But Ceres was there in Caerleon, definitely. There's archaeological evidence for her symbolism there. And another strange thing is that when you start looking at the archaeology of Britain, sort of Dark Age and Roman times, there are inscriptions of Brythonic goddesses, you know, like Brigantia in northern Britain. And there's Rosmerta in Gloucestershire, and Nemetona is there in Bath, Aquasulis as well. But these goddesses like Brigantia, Nemetona, Rosmerta, they don't appear in any of the Welsh stories. And there's no inscriptions of Rhiannon, Arian or Ceridwen. There's a real big why. Why isn't there archaeology to back up the Welsh stories? Or why don't the Welsh stories use the authentic names of known gods and goddesses? They're just not, there's like a missing link there.
Maybe they're avoiding persecution by not naming ancient gods and goddesses.
Yeah. I think, but yeah, you know, it's true, probably, you know, I think there's some logic to, you know, these stories for children, Mabinogi, are recorded at a time when you could be burnt for not being a true Catholic, you know, like the Cathars or what have you, you know. So if you can salvage it and save it as a fairy tale, so that was just kids for stories, you know, then somehow you have saved something.
And they often have the overlay of the scribe, don't they, talking about, you know, about God and Jesus, and, you know, there's lots of Christian references overlaid. So possibly they couldn't go further.
And maybe that's cover, you know, like, but look, I talked about, you know, all of this Catholicism.
It's true. We've just been studying Branch 2 with the Mabinogi, and even Branwen says, "Oh my God," and things like that. You know, I think she refers to Son of God at some point as well, you know. So that those Christian influences are there, you know. To strip it back to pre-Christian times, you'd have to go back to 400 AD or something, you know, and things weren't written down. You know, all you've got is inscriptions on altars and stuff.
And as you mentioned, there's much more of a diaspora in the ancient times than we've given heed to. You know, like there was a lot of fertilization from many cultures happening. You know, so these influences could have been circulating and moving around more than we realize.
Yeah. I always think of, like, before the Roman invasion, according to Julius Caesar, this is like 50 BC, he said the Druids used the Greek language for trade, you know, because of the south of France, it's the Mediterranean trading language. So any coastal trading, you use Greek to barter and everything. So in my mind, you know, whether the Greeks actually got to the British Isles, and one did, Pytheas, he got here. But you can imagine trading goods and sitting around a campfire and eating food, and you would start talking about the stars and what what mythologies you've got, or belief systems, or gods and goddesses, you know. So around the campfire, there is an exchange of stories and tribal wisdoms.
In a presentation by Robin Williamson, he refers to the language of Brutus as crooked Greek, and that always struck me, crooked Greek, and I thought that, you know, and when you say that it was used in trade, you know, you kind of see there's a little fun going on there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's when they might have started doing this kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
He said one thing, but his finger said something else. I think Robert Graves suggested a secret language with your nose, with, you know, doing Ogham things with your nose like that. And that reminded me of Bran wading through the Irish Sea, and there's the ridge of his nose and the eyes, you know.
Yeah.
So, but of course, I think certainly the Ogham is evidence of Celtic Irish sea trade, you know, where the Irish sea traders and raiders landed. They marked their territories with stones with Ogham inscriptions on them. And that's all up and down the west coast of Britain.
A little inspiration of the language of the birds. I wonder if Pryderi has anything to do with pride. You know, like when Pryderi's in the story, there's, you know, some elements of pride are going on in this event, or in this, if there's a psychological edge to it, you know, Pryderi's there because pride is involved.
In Welsh, it means care. So he's called that because of the care that his mother feels for him.
Oh.
And, you know, his father spelt with a P, Pwyll, but it's the same word as Bwyll, as in Gwythbwyll, the chess-like game. And so his father's name means wisdom or sense, you know, because it's with Bwyll, tree wisdom, tree sense. So that's interesting then, because the Taliesin poems, you know, the Battle of the Trees is the game Gwythbwyll, because that's a battle of trees, and that's branch 1 with Bwyll. And then in the Battle of the Trees poem, Gwydion, branch 4, recognizes Bran, branch 2, from the older branches on his shield, you know, and that's all Taliesin's writing, you know. So Taliesin is almost gluing elements of the 4 branches together there. It's enough to, yeah, it's complicated.
I'll offer a hypothesis of what this game, the object of the game. When there were many tribes speaking many languages, roaming around doing their trade, they wouldn't speak each other's language, but they knew a game that would introduce the strategy of what you're up to, because you didn't know if they were bluffing. They were straightforward, but it was a way of using the rules of the game to establish, you know, what do we, or when the 2 kings send out their poets to discuss, you know, is this an invasion or is this a trading party? What do you know, why have you landed on the shores here? And then they don't have the language, but they bring out a game and start showing each other strategies of what we're up to. I don't know if that makes any sense, but just a thought.
It's definitely, you know, the Gaelic Celts of Ireland and the Brythonic Celts of Wales, they're playing the same game and speaking a different language. Although there's similarities, like they Gwern and Wern for the older tree, you know, their languages are very similar. You know, I'm not a Welsh speaker myself, you know, I speak English, and I started learning French some years ago, and I got a really good series of CDs by someone called Michel Thomas, and he explained that about 10,000 English words are actually French in origin. That wasn't explained at school. French seemed an alien language, but table is table. It's the same word, it's spelt the same, means the same thing. But I always find it strange to me, that we speak English, but the Druids were speaking Greek, that the Greek language was being spoken in the British Isles long before English. It's mad.
There's some words in Welsh that sound the same as French, and German words as well. So you've got
yes.
fenest, which sounds like the French fenêtre, and the German fenster. So fenest in Welsh for window.
There must be a lot of Latin borrowings from the Roman occupation of Wales. And of course, French is Latin language, isn't it, largely?
Yes, and the word for church is another one. So yes. Eglwys, or it sounds like eglise, doesn't it?
Like ecclesiastical.
Yeah. Yes.
There's so many poems.
English is such a mixed up language, though, because we've appropriated so many different words from different other languages. I remember studying English language and trying to work out the sort of Viking words that made their way into our language, and all the other sources. And it's a very, very mixed up weed of a language, isn't it? Much though I love it.
It's a real melting pot, a cauldron.
Yeah. So worried about pronouncing some Welsh words, and I met a man who lived in Anglesey, and he was born and bred Anglesey, and I said to him, because I was just curious, I said, do you understand someone speaking Welsh in South Wales? And he said no.
Yeah, there's lots of different words for things in North and South Wales, yeah.
So
I especially like the word for money, which is arian in South Wales, which is silver, or pres in North Wales, which is brass. So presumably shows they were poorer in North Wales than in South Wales.
Brilliant. So that, North Wales, I think that, looking at the suggested history in the 13 treasures and stuff, the Britons, after the Romans left, were as far north as the Clyde and, the lowland mountains, if you like, but they were certainly in Dumbarton. It means fort of the Britons and stuff. And I think those northern Britons exodus to what we now call North Wales, whereas the Britons from, what would you say, Wiltshire, Somerset, Gloucestershire, went to South Wales, so they're different groups of Brythonic Romanized people, but also South Wales has a massive Irish influence. It was an Irish settlement as well.
I come from Edinburgh in the south of Scotland, and I didn't know that about the Welsh language when I was growing up. But there's a hill near where my mum lives now. It's called Cwniger Hill, and I couldn't work out why it was called that. But Cwningen is Welsh for rabbit, so I don't know, but I just wonder if there's a connection. Although it's Norse. What were you saying? Sorry, Cwniger is something like king in Norse, so it could be from that. But it was interesting how far north the Welsh, or it wasn't Welsh because there was no conception of Wales, but that language spread.
That's another thing, like the Welsh political party call themselves Plaid Cymru. They don't call themselves Welsh. It's a word that came from a Saxon word for foreigner. So the sad thing is that anyone saying I'm proud to be Welsh, they're actually saying I'm proud to be a foreigner. It's just it's like a black person calling themselves the N-word or something, you know. It's just weird. Why do that, you know?
Isn't that where Engels came from as well, an Anglo-Saxon? Doesn't that mean other?
Oh, does it? You know,
I think
and
so.
like in Cornwall, they call themselves Cornish. They don't call themselves Cornwallish, you know, because Cornwall is the Kern foreigners. You know, it's like it's Kerno, the Cornish, not Cornwallish. So it's that wall is the same as the Welsh thing for foreigner. Under the term Saxons, there's so many Germanic groups, aren't there? There's the Jutes and the Angles and the Frisians, and yeah, they all just get simplified as Saxon or Sassenach. And the whole Arthur thing, that Vortigern invited them over and he was a bad king, that's another myth. You know, the Germanic people were already here in the Roman occupation because they were Roman auxiliary troops and mercenaries and stuff. They were already settled here in Roman Britain. So when Rome left, there was no police to stop them spreading, and they spread, you know. Lots to think.
So I have a question. You know, you say the Druids spoke Greek. Did they always speak Greek, or did they only speak Greek when they were trading?
We've only got passing reference that Julius Caesar wrote down. And one of the interesting things is he said that the Druids did not write anything down. They actually considered recording thing bad for the memory training of their students, you know, that it would weaken their minds if they didn't memorize what they needed to memorize, you know. So it's in a paragraph of Julius Caesar saying that the Druids didn't put anything in writing. And then he says, but they use Greek as a trade language, you know, then it's just, that's all you get. You don't get much more than that, you know.
Mm-hmm. You know, my grandfather was the hereditary chief of the Upper Klamath Nation, and he had so much wisdom. And one of the things that he told me was that the Blaikni people only had 200 words in their entire vocabulary. And that with most indigenous people throughout the world, speaking was kind of overrated. There was that indigenous people found so much strength in just the quietude of gathering around a council fire. It was almost as though it was telepathic. And I never forgot that. I really, I don't know. And I feel like maybe the Druids may have been like that to an extent themselves, you know. I don't know. That just came into my mind.
I think too much left brain activity can shut down your psychism for certain. We have to try and walk a path of balance, don't we? Use left and right brain. But yeah, most of us are so left-brained that we're not dreaming or having visions or empathy or what have you.
It's a catastrophe. You know, this intuitive mind has been so neglected. Yeah. And the result is, you know, really like really out of balance.
Well, that's why Steiner was so important in the whole Waldorf movement, because he really wanted, you know, the young children to develop their imagination and to go deep into that, the world, you know. Yeah. This was fun, Yuri. Thank you.
Yeah, no, just thinking of Taliesin again then, so that his poetry after he is found in the Salmon Weir, where he works for Gwyfno Garin here and Eltham, and that's where some of the best Taliesin poem is. And what's interesting is he's been here, he's been there, he was at the Tower of Babel, and he was at the foot of the crucifixion. It's sort of like he's had all of these lives. And he's gone from being this lad called Gwion to this radiant brow that remembers being here, there, and everywhere in different incarnations and stuff. So that what we've just said about left brain and right brain, that's like he's totally switched on to his eternal self rather than his mortal self somehow. You know, what would you call that? A higher spirit, higher self thing. Yeah.
That's a nice book.
If you go back to the YouTube clip about the circumpolar stars, the central stars, it's only a couple of videos ago, and the Cassiopeia, Cleistone being the throne of the Queen of Heaven, or the breasts of the Queen of Heaven, the Taliesin poem says, I have sat on the throne of the distributor, and he talks about the Milky Way in the same breath. And also, as one of the 7 survivors in branch 2, where they take Bran's head and they listen to the singing of the birds of Rhiannon, and the birds of Rhiannon are the 3 birds of the summer triangle. In his poem, Taliesin says, I have come from the region of the summer stars. You know, so there are these references that start to sing about star lore mysticism in the Taliesin poems. But when he says throne of the distributor in the Milky Way, you know what he's talking about, you know. Right, time to go. So we've got Hazel in about, I don't know, 9 days time or something. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Gail.
Thank you, Yuri.
Hey.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.